My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 32 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I stood on a farmhouse porch in October, holding a box of hand-blown glass vases, and listened to my own mother tell a stranger that I had died 6 years earlier in a car accident. I was standing 3 feet behind her when she said it. She had no idea. And what happened over the next 3 days, what my grandmother had already been quietly building before I ever knew there was anything to build, is going to take a while to tell you properly, so settle in. Before I start, if you've ever been the person your family found easier to explain away than to explain honestly, this channel is for you. Please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying the story, because that actually helps more than you think. And drop your location and your local time in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love knowing where all of you are joining me from tonight. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, the older of 2 daughters. My sister Paige is 4 years younger than me, and if you'd asked anyone in our extended family to describe the 2 of us growing up, you'd have gotten almost the exact same answer every time. Paige was the golden one. Bright, funny, the kind of kid who could walk into a room and have 3 adults competing to talk to her within a minute. I was the other one. Good grades, competitive swim team, first chair clarinet, the kind of daughter who never once got a call home from a teacher. In most families, that would be considered an asset. In mine, it slowly became something closer to camouflage. I wasn't a problem, so I wasn't a priority. I want you to sit with that distinction for a second, because it's going to matter for everything that comes after. My mother, Diane, ran our household the way some people run a small business, with an image to protect and a bottom line she never spoke about out loud. My father, Robert, worked as an accountant for a regional bank, quiet, steady, the kind of man who read the newspaper cover to cover every Sunday and rarely offered an opinion on anything that happened inside our own walls. I loved my father. I still do, in the complicated way you love someone who never once stood between you and something that hurt. By the time I was 26, I had moved 3 hours away to Charlotte for a job as an architect at a mid-sized firm downtown. I built an actual life there. A quiet 1-bedroom apartment near the arts district, a small tight circle of friends I'd made through a running club, a career I was genuinely proud of, drafting community centers and small civic buildings, the kind of projects that felt like they mattered. I called my mother every couple of weeks, like clockwork, a habit I'd never once let myself break, even when the calls started feeling less like conversations and more like status updates I was required to file. She'd ask about work in the vaguest possible terms. She'd tell me about Paige, always Paige, the new boyfriend, the promotion, the vacation, the apartment renovation. Then she'd find a reason to hang up. I want you to understand, I didn't notice the pattern for years. When you grow up inside a dynamic like that, you don't see the shape of the water. You just learn to swim in it. What I did not know for 6 full years is that somewhere inside that pattern, my mother had built an entire second version of my life, and in that version, I simply didn't exist anymore. It started, I would eventually learn, the year I turned 26. That was the year of the accident. I was driving home from a late meeting on I-40 when a truck merged into my lane without checking, and I ended up in a ditch with a totaled sedan, a broken collarbone, 3 cracked ribs, and 5 days in the hospital in Charlotte. My mother came once. She stayed 2 hours, told me hospitals made her physically ill, and left. I remember being hurt by that in a small, private way I didn't examine too closely, and then I forgave her, because that's the muscle I trained my whole life. What I didn't know is that somewhere in that visit, or in the weeks right after it, a story was born in my mother's mind, a story where her oldest daughter hadn't survived that crash. I still don't fully understand the psychology of why a person would build that particular lie, instead of just letting the truth sit there, unremarkable. A daughter who lives 3 hours away and doesn't call enough. But I know when it started. And I know now exactly how far it went. I don't know the precise date my mother began telling people I had died, because by the time I found out, the story was old, polished, worn smooth by repetition, the way a stone gets smooth in a river. I only know that by the time my sister Paige got engaged to a man named Grant Hastings, whose family owned 3 car dealerships and half the membership roster at the county's most exclusive golf club, the story of my death had been circulating in certain rooms for at least 2 years, possibly longer, told with the specific practiced grief of someone who has learned exactly which details make a lie land. Paige called me the week of her engagement, and I want to be fair to her here, because what I'd learn later complicates things, but in that moment, she called sounding genuinely thrilled, gushing about the proposal at a vineyard, about Grant, about the Caldwell family. Sorry, the Hastings family offering their restored farmhouse for the rehearsal dinner. She asked me to come to the wedding. She never once mentioned that, to the family paying for half of it, I was supposed to be dead. I've thought about this a great deal since, and my honest read is that Paige assumed her mother had simply given the Hastings family some vague, unremarkable version of our distance. Estranged sisters. Nothing dramatic. Paige had absolutely no idea what her mother had actually constructed, brick by careful brick, over years. I said yes immediately. I requested the time off work, booked a hotel room 40 minutes from the venue, and spent an evening at a small glass studio in Charlotte picking out a wedding gift. A set of hand-blown vases in deep amber and blue, the kind of thing that takes real time to choose well. I wrapped them myself the night before I drove home, sitting cross-legged on my apartment floor with brown paper and twine, genuinely happy, genuinely looking forward to seeing my little sister get married. I should tell you, before we go further, about a phone call I got 2 weeks before the wedding, because it's one of those small, easy-to-miss details that only make sense once you know everything else. My mother called on a Tuesday evening, and in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation about wedding logistics, she asked me, almost too casually, whether I'd been in touch with any of my father's side of the family lately, specifically my father's brother, Uncle Dale, who still lived in our old hometown. I said no, not really, we weren't close. She said, good, that's fine, in a tone that struck me as strange even at the time, though I didn't understand why until much later. I would eventually learn that my mother had spent those 2 weeks quietly, carefully managing exactly who might accidentally say something true to the Hastings family before the wedding. Uncle Dale, it turned out, was one of the very few people who still occasionally mentioned me by name in public. I drove the 3 hours home the morning of the rehearsal dinner because Paige had asked me, almost as an afterthought during a phone call 2 days earlier, if I wanted to come a day early. I want you to picture this with me because I need you to really feel what walking into that house felt like. It was a beautiful, cool October evening, that particular golden light you only get in the mountains in autumn. The Hastings family had rented out a restored 1800s farmhouse for the rehearsal dinner, white string lights already glowing under a darkening sky, the kind of setting you'd see in a wedding magazine. I parked at the edge of a gravel lot already half full of luxury SUVs and pickup trucks, picked up my gift, and walked toward the porch, where I could hear laughter and glasses clinking somewhere inside. My mother was standing just inside the open doorway, mid-sentence, talking to an older woman in a cream-colored dress. I would learn within seconds that this was Margaret Hastings, Grant's mother, and my mother was saying, in a tone she usually reserved for talking about the weather, a tone so casual it took my brain a full second to process the words. It was such a tragedy. Claire was our oldest. She passed 6 years ago in a car accident. We don't really talk about it. It's still very hard on all of us. I stood there in the doorway holding a box of hand-blown glass vases and listened to my mother describe my own death to a stranger. Margaret Hastings turned first. Her eyes went to me, then back to my mother, then back to me again. The specific look you give to things that don't make sense standing next to each other. "I'm sorry," she said slowly. "This is..." My mother turned around, and I need you to understand. There was no gasp, no relief, no flicker of joy at seeing her supposedly deceased daughter alive and well on a porch. There was only a flash of pure, cold panic, gone in under 2 seconds, replaced immediately by something far worse. "Calculation, Claire," she said, her voice climbing into something bright and brittle I'd heard maybe twice before in my life. "You made it." I didn't think, we didn't know of your flight. "Oh, honey, come in." I didn't move. I stood there with the box in my hands and said the only thing I could think to say. "Mom, why does Mrs. Hastings think I died 6 years ago?" The porch went quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet when everyone suddenly finds something urgent to do with their eyes. Margaret Hastings looked at my mother, waiting, because she deserved an answer too. My mother laughed, a short, sharp, unconvincing sound. "There's clearly been some kind of misunderstanding. Let's not do this right now, we have guests." I set the vases down gently on the porch railing because apparently some habits don't break even in a moment like that one. "I'd actually love to hear the explanation," I said, as calmly as I could manage. I think Margaret would too. My father, Robert, appeared behind my mother a moment later, and where her face had gone into full performance mode, his did the opposite. He went pale, silent. He looked at me the way you look at an old debt that's finally walked through the front door to collect. He didn't say a word. Paige came around the corner in her rehearsal dress, saw me, and her face lit up genuinely, the way it always used to before the temperature of the room caught up with her. "Claire, oh my God, you actually came." Then quieter to our mother, "Wait, why does everyone look like this?" Nobody answered her either. Margaret Hastings, to her considerable credit, was the one who finally broke the silence properly. She looked at my mother with the calm, precise attention of a woman who has run a household long enough to notice immediately when the numbers stop adding up. "Diane," she said, "you told me more than once that you'd lost your eldest daughter. You told me the story of the accident. You cried telling me, Diane. I want to understand what is happening right now." My mother's mouth opened and closed. "It's complicated, Margaret. Family things. I didn't want it to overshadow the wedding." I looked at my mother and asked the only question that actually mattered to me. Not "why did you lie?" "How long? How long have you been telling people I was dead, Mom?" She wouldn't answer. She reached instead for Margaret's arm, trying to steer her back inside, back toward the party, back toward the version of the evening where nothing uncomfortable had just happened. Margaret didn't move an inch. I want to pause the story here because I know a lot of you are already asking yourselves the same question I was asking myself standing on that porch. Why would a mother tell an entire wealthy, well-connected family that her living daughter was dead? What could that possibly accomplish? I didn't have a real answer that night. It would take me 3 more days, 1 law firm, and a folder full of documents to understand the whole shape of it. But standing there, all I had was the immediate, humiliating fact of it, and a room full of strangers now looking at me like a ghost who'd wandered in from the wrong party. I picked the vases back up off the railing, walked past all of them, straight to my car, and drove to my hotel. I didn't cry until I was in the parking lot with the engine off. Then I sat there for a long time, the kind of crying where your chest shakes but your mouth stays shut. Because even alone in a parking lot, you've been trained your whole life not to make a scene. If this is already making your stomach turn a little, I understand completely. Stay with me, because it gets more complicated before it gets resolved, and I want to ask you something once we get there. Drop a comment telling me what you'd have done standing on that porch, hearing your own mother describe you as dead to a stranger's face. I checked into my hotel room that night and did the one thing that has never once failed me in my life. I got quiet and I got organized. If there's one thing being an architect teaches you, it's that when something doesn't make structural sense, you don't argue with the wall. You go find the blueprint. The first call I made was to my grandmother, Eleanor, my mother's own mother, 81 years old, still living alone in the house she raised my mother in, sharp as a tack, and, as I would very quickly learn, far more aware of what had been happening in our family than any of us had ever given her credit for. She picked up on the second ring. "Claire," she said, before I'd even said hello, "I take it you finally showed up somewhere you weren't supposed to." I asked her what she meant, and my grandmother, in her steady, unbothered voice, told me something that changed the entire shape of that night for me. "Your mother's been telling people you died for years, sweetheart. I found out about 2 years ago, at your cousin Melissa's baby shower, when a woman I'd never met offered me her condolences for losing a granddaughter I was very much still speaking to on the phone every other month. I asked her why she never told me. Because I didn't fully understand it yet either, she said. And because I was too busy doing something about it, instead of just being upset about it. That's the sentence I want you to hold on to, because it's the hinge this whole story turns on. My grandmother had spent the 2 years since that baby shower quietly working with her longtime attorney, a man named Harold Denny, who had handled her affairs for over 20 years, to understand exactly what my mother had been doing, and more importantly, why. Not just the lie itself, the money underneath it. Here's what Harold eventually laid out for me in careful, documented detail over the following 2 days. My grandfather, before he passed when I was 24, had set aside a modest trust meant to be split evenly between his 2 granddaughters, Paige and me, to be distributed when each of us turned 30. I had turned 32 years earlier. I had never received a single dollar of it, and I had never even been told the trust existed. My mother, as trustee, carried 2 separate legal obligations: distribute my portion to me on schedule, and because the trust required annual confirmation that both named beneficiaries were living, provide proof of my continued existence to the estate's attorney for the yearly filing. My mother had submitted for 2 consecutive years documentation claiming I had passed away in order to have my entire portion of that trust redirected into an account she controlled. She had done this while simultaneously continuing to quietly access an old joint checking account from when I was 18, one that had never technically been closed, cashing small checks under my name that I never once saw or knew existed. I want to say the total number out loud because it's the number that turned 3 days of confusion into pure, cold clarity for me. $164,000. That was my share of my grandfather's trust, filed as legally forfeited due to my supposed death, and quietly redirected, over roughly 2 years, into renovations on my parents' house, a new roof, an updated kitchen, and, as it turned out, a significant portion of Paige's upcoming wedding, the barn deposit, the florist, the open bar. My mother hadn't just told an awkward lie to save face at a rehearsal dinner. She had built and maintained, in writing, a legal fiction of my death, filed annually with an actual estate attorney, specifically in order to keep money that was legally mine. Harold told me something else on that first call that I've thought about often since. He said my grandmother had been waiting for the right, sturdy moment to bring this forward, one where my mother wouldn't have time to scramble and cover her tracks further. "I think that moment just found you on its own, showing up at that wedding," he said. He asked me one question gently, giving me the choice my mother had never once given me. Did I want this handled quietly, privately, in a conference room somewhere with lawyers and closed doors? Or did I want it handled the way my mother had chosen to handle her lie, in front of the exact people she'd told it to? I thought about Margaret Hastings' face on that porch. I thought about how calmly and precisely she had asked for the truth, and how my mother had tried to physically steer her away from it instead. In front of everyone, I said, "But she gets 3 days." I want Paige's wedding to happen first. Paige doesn't deserve to have her wedding blown up over this, whatever else is true. But the day after, everyone who heard that lie gets to hear the truth in the same room. If you're still with me, I want to ask you something, because I've gone back and forth on this every single day since. Would you have waited those 3 days for your sister's sake the way I did? Or would you have said something right there on the porch in front of Margaret and let the whole rehearsal dinner collapse on the spot? Tell me honestly in the comments. I want to walk you through those 3 days because they weren't quiet ones. My phone did not stop. My mother texted first, late that same night, a message that read simply, "We need to talk before tomorrow." Please don't do anything rash. I didn't respond. 20 minutes later, a second text. Your father is very upset. This isn't fair to him. I still didn't respond. Some habits apparently run in families. My mother had spent years deploying my father's feelings as a kind of shield, and some part of her clearly assumed it would still work. The next morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, a Cedar Bluff area code equivalent, a woman's voice I eventually placed as my cousin Melissa, the one from the baby shower. She'd heard something had happened at the rehearsal dinner through the family group chat, a chat I'd been quietly removed from years earlier without ever being told. "Claire, I don't know what's going on, but Aunt Diane just posted something about family stress and needing prayers, and I wanted to check on you directly." I told her carefully that I was fine and that she'd probably understand everything in a few days. She said, "I always wondered why you never came up in conversation." I'm so sorry, whatever this is. That call stayed with me. It was the first small crack, a side confirmation that other people had noticed my absence too, even if they'd never known what to make of it. That afternoon, my father called, which almost never happened. He doesn't call. He emails short factual things about weather or ball games. Hearing his voice on the phone felt strange, like picking up a tool you'd forgotten you owned. "Claire," he said, "your mother is beside herself. Can we please just talk this through as a family before the wedding?" I asked him one direct question. "Dad, did you know she told people I was dead?" A long silence. I knew she'd stopped mentioning you to certain people. I didn't know it had gone that far. I asked him if he'd ever asked her why. Another silence, longer this time, and then, quietly, no. He hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat with that for a long time. Not knowing had been his choice too. Every single year he chose not to ask. The wedding happened 2 days later, and I did attend, sitting quietly near the back of the barn, watching my sister marry a man she genuinely loved, surrounded by a family who had no idea what was coming for them. My mother avoided me completely the entire day, which was honestly a mercy. I didn't want a scene at Paige's wedding any more than I wanted my own resurrection turned into the reception's evening entertainment. The day after the wedding, my grandmother hosted what she called a small family lunch at her own house. She invited my parents, my sister, and her brand new husband, and at my specific request, Margaret and her husband, Franklin Hastings, framed simply as closing out some family business before everyone travels home. My mother, still trying to manage the narrative, apparently assumed this meant a private, quiet apology session where she could smooth things over one relationship at a time, the way she'd smoothed over every uncomfortable thing in our family for 30 years. Harold Denny arrived exactly on time, in a gray suit, carrying a leather folder that looked, fittingly, almost identical to the one that had already reshaped my last 3 days. My grandmother sat at the head of her own table, poured coffee for everyone with steady hands, and said once everyone was seated, "Before we eat, Harold has something to go over with the family." "I think it concerns all of us." My mother's smile flickered. "Mom, is this really necessary right now?" "It's necessary," my grandmother said, without raising her voice even slightly, because you made it necessary 2 years ago. Harold opened this folder and in a calm, factual, almost bored tone, the way you'd read a weather report aloud, laid out exactly what he had laid out to me over the phone. The trust, the 30th birthday distribution requirement, the 2 consecutive filings claiming my death, the redirected funds, the exact dollar amount, $164,000, read aloud in front of Margaret and Franklin Hastings, in front of Paige, who had gone completely white in her seat, and in front of my father, who stared at the table and said absolutely nothing, the way he always did. Margaret Hastings set down her coffee cup very carefully. "Diane," she said, "you told me my granddaughter's aunt was dead." At my own dinner table, while defrauding an estate, my mother tried one last time to reach for the old script. "This is a misunderstanding. This is being twisted." I was going to explain everything to Claire eventually. I finally spoke as calmly as I could manage, because I had promised myself I wouldn't give her the version of me that raises her voice. "You didn't explain it to me, Mom. You explained it to an estate attorney in writing as a legal death, so you could keep my money. There's a difference between a lie and a filing." Paige, to her considerable credit, looked at our mother and asked the only question that mattered to her. "Did you use my wedding to cover for stealing from Claire?" My mother didn't answer that one either. Harold closed his folder and said simply that the estate would be pursuing repayment, and that given the nature of the false filings, the matter had already been flagged for the estate's insurer, which meant this was no longer purely a family conversation. It was, as he put it gently but plainly, now a paperwork problem larger than anyone sitting at this table. I want to tell you what happened in the days and weeks that followed, because I think that part matters just as much as the confrontation itself. Word moved through the family the way it always does in a town like ours, quietly at first, then all at once. My Uncle Dale called me 2 days later, gruff and awkward the way he always is, and told me he'd always suspected something was off, but had never once had the courage to ask my mother directly. My cousin Melissa sent a long, apologetic text about all the years she'd never questioned my absence from family gatherings. Even a woman named Bev, my mother's neighbor of nearly 20 years, apparently stopped my mother in her own driveway one afternoon and asked point blank why she'd never once mentioned having 2 daughters in 2 decades of casual conversation. My mother, according to Bev, who mentioned it to my grandmother, who mentioned it to me, mumbled something about it being a painful subject and quickly went inside. My mother did eventually repay the trust in installments, under legal pressure rather than genuine remorse, a fact I want to be honest about rather than pretend otherwise. My father, for the first time in my adult life, called me on his own, without my mother anywhere nearby, and apologized, quietly, haltingly, for never once asking where I actually was in any of the family stories over the years. It wasn't a full repair. It was at least a real start, the first honest thing he'd said to me in longer than I could remember. Paige and I are closer now than we've ever been in our entire lives. She told me months later, over coffee near my apartment in Charlotte, that she'd spent years genuinely believing I simply didn't want a relationship with the family, because that's the vague, careful language she'd always been given. Finding out the actual truth didn't just clear my name in some abstract sense. It gave her back a sister she hadn't known she was missing. My grandmother still lives in that same house. When I visit now, she tells me she always knew I'd come back into the family story on my own terms eventually, and that all she'd had to do, in the meantime, was make sure the paperwork was ready when I finally did. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that silence protects the person telling the lie, never the person living the truth. I spent 6 years being quietly written out of my own family story, one omission at a time, and it took one porch, one box of glass vases, and one very patient grandmother with an excellent lawyer to write me back in. If this story reminded you of anyone in your own life, someone who's ever gone quiet while somebody else rewrote the truth around them, please share this with them tonight. And if you want to know what happens in these families when the truth finally gets a chance to speak for itself, subscribe, because I've got a lot more stories like this one to tell you. Comment below and let me know. Would you have waited 3 days like I did? Or would you have said it right there on the porch in front of everyone? I read every single comment, and I will see you in the next one.